Greetings and welcome to the Hourlings podcast project. My name is Martin Wilsey and I'm your host. Tonight, the moderator is going to be Shay. So I'm going to toss it over to Shay. Take it away.
All right, you guys. Before we start recording, Marty asked me a very ironic question. He asked if I wanted to preface this recording with anything. And I emphatically said no, because a lot of us here, you will find shortly, are against anything that comes before getting right to the main story, cutting right to it. But that doesn't mean we're not going to talk about it and defend our arguments, defend our positions about why we don't like them. Or maybe one of us do like them. I don't know. We'll be surprised. So we're going to go over prologues, forewords, prefaces, and introductions. So these are all front matter items that you might find in front of a book, although some of them are exclusive to nonfiction and some are exclusive to fiction. So let's go over that. So the nonfiction ones, usually I'm sure walls can be broken. So I guess I won't, say hold me to everything. But the nonfiction ones are going to be your foreword, your preface, and your introduction. And the fiction one is going to be your prologue. David is holding up The Cruel Sea. Why, David? Tell us.
So this is a rather famous best-selling war story about World War II from the 1950s that actually has a fiction preface. It's one page and sets up the conflict and even tells you why the name of the story. It's the only example I could find. There
you go. See, some authors go crazy with it. But so yeah, let's give a brief definition of what they are for our readers who don't know, and then we'll get into talking about it and debating it together as a team. So forewords will usually be the first thing, if there is any front matter, will usually be the first thing in a nonfiction book. And those are normally written not by the author. They're written by someone, like another expert in the field, or maybe even a celebrity or political figure. And the purpose of them is to give credibility to the author, sometimes to set the stage, but really to pat the author on the head and say, read this book, I liked it, and here's why it's important, or here's what this author contributes with this book. So that's what a foreword does. A preface would come next, and that's written by the author, him or herself, and that gives some background as to why the author wrote the book and sometimes how the author wrote the book. And then there is the introduction, which goes over the main topics of what that nonfiction book is going to address and provides sort of a blueprint, a field map, if you will, for the reader to get an idea of where that entire book is going to take them. Introductions are actually pretty important, so I actually don't have any bad things to say about that, but we'll see what everyone else thinks. And lastly, a prologue is the one that you will find in fiction before chapter 1. And those usually, from my experience of reading prologues, are either written from a different character's point of view than the main character, or set very far back in the timeline, or set in a very distant setting. Something that is just detached from the author's point of view anyway, from the main story. But there is a heated debate about prologues. Do we like them or do we hate them? I emphatically dislike prologues because I think that readers would skip over it and it should just be called chapter 1 and just go right into it. But I have a friend who shall remain nameless, who is, he's a good friend of mine though, who's in a writing group with me, and he absolutely loves prologues and defends them and says that he gets into the story more when there's a prologue, and it just does it for him. So what do you guys think? Let's start with prologues. What do you think about prologues?
I hate them.
Oh, okay, 2 for hate. Jeffrey?
Well, to me, they're more, why didn't you just release that as a short story separate from the novel to build your novel up? Like, you could have given it as a teaser to advertise your novel. If it's not consequential to the story except building background, then maybe it should have just been a freebie that you give to say, hey, you want to read more? I got a whole novel in this world.
So I'm going to put you down as anti-prologue then, is that correct?
Yeah, you definitely can put me down as
3 for anti-prologue. David?
So I think it's a tool in the writer's toolbox.
Oh boy.
Just like a plot twist, say one of M. Night Shyamalan's big twist endings. I think it's a tool. It works sometimes, but if you use it all the time, it's going to get too repetitive.
Okay, so I would say we have
hold on. And to Jeffrey's thing, If you can take a prologue out and package it up as a separate story, then it's not a prologue.
Well, to add on to that, prologues are done wrong so often. That's why a large segment of the book buying population just plain will not buy a book with a prologue. They will get into the Amazon preview pages. If the first thing they see is a prologue, they just won't buy the book. And that there was enough for me to never do a prologue on my books until I'm so famous that it doesn't matter that
I will confess that I have not written a book that required a prologue, but I can see some situations where it could happen.
So
see, a lot of prologues. I've actually read a lot of prologues, and they fall into a couple categories, and all of these categories are just not good. The most common one I see is like a world building info dump. Really horrible way to start your book. Do not bore your readers trying to set your stage to, you know, establish the environment, to like tell them, you know, it is the worst kind of telling instead of showing. Don't bore them. Info dumps is the thing that bugs me the most with prologues. Just don't do it.
I can agree with you on that.
And it's so easy to do a bad prologue. I see a lot of books that will add a prologue because their first chapter was a quiet chapter, a peaceful chapter, and somebody in their writers group told them, no, you got to have this book start off with a bang and do a hook. And if you just have a prologue in the beginning just for a hook, that then you never see those characters again, or your POV completely changes and you're wondering what the hell did happen. It's a bait and switch on the readers. I mean, there's so many examples of things that can go wrong with a prologue. A lot of prologues that I've read don't even have the main characters in the prologues. The characters in the prologues may never be mentioned ever again in the book. I mean, that is just like total bait and switch on the users.
From what my friend described to me as what appeals to him about prologues is he takes it as a signal that this book is going to be a richer, deeper, more complex novel. Almost the same way that you would take Once Upon a Time to be a signal that this is going to be a fairy tale. So he sees it as an integral part of fantasy. So what would your response be to him if you were here? I'm gonna represent him.
He's just plain wrong. I mean, you can say the world is flat. You just plain play wrong.
Meaning, Marty's saying he's plain wrong that a prologue necessarily means you have a deeper, richer book.
Right. I think prologues are lazier.
So I think there's differences via genre. So, for instance, here's another book by a little-known author, which has a prologue which sets up the ultimate enemy for the series. So you see it a lot in fantasy.
Right.
I did sort of an informal survey of my collection. You see it a lot in fantasy. You see it somewhat in thrillers, and you see it an awful lot in like either military fiction or military science fiction. It seems more intrusive in some of the other genres. So if you're a friend who likes fantasy,
yeah, he loves fantasy.
Something you see in epic fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like Marty, I've seen it done well and I've seen it done badly.
I think that in that case, it's almost hard to blame upcoming writers for emulating prologues because, like you were saying, David, some of the greats have prologues.
You see, the thing that is a trap for beginning authors is that Stephen King and George R.R. Martin and these big names, they can do whatever the hell they want.
Right.
People will still buy their books.
Right.
The thing is, you don't want to have any tripwires that stop a reader from buying your book.
Out of curiosity-
Prologues are so often
A tripwire.
disliked that many people say, I don't buy books with prologues, or worse yet, I skip over them.
That's good
Because-
feedback.
Because a prologue that's skippable is
Shouldn't be
you
in
can
there.
cut it out then.
Shouldn't be in there anyway.
So let me ask you something, David. That is how the first edition of a Game of Thrones appeared with a prologue, or is that a more recent edition? Was it added later?
No, the prologue was always there, and that
Always
is
there,
the
yeah.
first edition hardcover.
Mm-hmm.
So let's use that as a case study. And I know not everyone has read the prologue of Game of Thrones, and I read it a long time ago even, so I don't even quite remember it. But why could that prologue not just have been called chapter 1 and everything move up a chapter?
It's interesting. It sets up a situation which Jon Snow ends up investigating. It's the walkers beyond the wall, basically the zombies from the icy north. So it starts to establish the dread of, here are all of these kings and queens fighting over who rules Westeros, while a much darker, dangerous threat.
And that's cool. But again, I'll press the question
as
again.
a
Why
winter
could that not just be
comes.
called chapter 1?
It didn't feature any of the characters from that we're supposed to be following. In fact, the characters we were following actually get killed in the prologue,
So,
and Jon Snow ends up investigating that situation later on.
so is it therefore a rule, which I know rules can be broken, but is it a rule that if your first chapter starts with a point of view that's not a character you'll be following, a main character, it has to be called a prologue?
I've seen it both ways, and Marty can, I think, attest to this. I've also seen a first chapter in a mystery novel, which is from the viewpoint of, say, a serial killer,
Right.
and it's their first, say their first victim, and the
Right.
main character gets introduced in chapter 2 as he has to go to the homicide site. That could have been established as a prologue, but it wasn't. It was labeled as.
Yeah, I guess I'm choosing a hill to die on.
I
which
think
is
the
like-
author has some options there.
Yeah, and I guess my hill is like, you write whatever you want for the beginning. Write a prologue, and then just change the word prologue to chapter 1. I'm happy. Like that's kind of the argument I'm trying to make, but I don't know if it's
All
one
the
that-
best written prologues are the best because they could have just been chapter 1.
Right.
Well, I mean, and if you think of the beginning of one of the biggest urban fantasies there is, The Philosopher's Stone or The Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, I mean, chapter 1 is prologue-ish. I mean, it's Harry as a boy with the Dementors and all that, click, click, click,
Mhm.
or not the Dementors, excuse me, with Dumbledore, click, 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 turning off all the lights and all of that, and Hagrid. And it's establishing this, but Harry is just a baby. He's not really the POV character in that one scene, and he's only the POV in the next scene in that first chapter. But you could have done that or she could have done that as a prologue.
No,
she didn't.
it's chapter 1.
It's
And
chapter
it should have
1.
been chapter 1.
Exactly. Even though you never do Dumbledore's perspective thereafter.
Well,
Right.
the weird thing is that skips along, the beginning of her book skips along 10 years later, he gets the letter,
Yeah, he's
and,
talking to the snake.
and, all of that stuff. It's,
Yep, living in the
but it's not a
Wingspan.
prologue.
So
It's
I
not
think
written
as
like a
a
prologue, because a lot of times prologues, and the thing that bugs me about prologues the most is when they have very little to do with the main story and the main characters of the book.
Mhm.
And
Well, that's another flaw. That's another way to write a bad prologue.
it's like, okay, prologue happens, all this adventure, all this action happens.
Mhm.
1,000 years later, I
Right.
hate that. I just
right. Where the author, I mean, the reader would almost rather stay in the setting of the prologue instead of jumping to, the actual story, and they feel cheated.
And I think also the info dumpy prologues, it just is, I would agree with you, Marty, lazy, because a good writer can take each one of those pieces of bullet point, take that prologue, put into bullet points. And you can take each one of those bullet points and find an appropriate place within the main narrative to give that information. You just pepper them throughout your novel, and you'll still have flavored the novel as you needed, except without dumping it all at one time just to make a prologue.
Which is something, honestly, an author could make the mistake of doing in chapter 1 too.
Yeah.
That is absolutely true.
So,
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that the TLDR for our opinion on Prologs is that we recognize that it was maybe past tense a motif in fantasy and sci-fi, as David was saying, but has become a criticized one in a modern lens, and we discourage, I think, as a whole, new writers anyway, from using prologues. Instead, just jump right into chapter 1, or like I said, write a prologue, have a blast, have a great time with it, and then just change the word prologue to chapter 1, and we're all happy with you. So let's move on to four. You want to go ahead, Jeffrey? You had
Well,
one?
I was just going to say, and I would just reiterate my advice from the beginning. That prologue that you think is so cool might be just a way to sell your novel by giving it away for free.
Right. It could be a short story, or it could be cut. If you can skip a prologue, you can just cut a prologue. All right. So on to forwards. We're going to shift our position here to nonfiction. I don't know how much you guys write nonfiction, but certainly I'm sure you've read nonfiction. So what's your opinion on forwards? Again, these are front matter of nonfiction books written not by the author, but by a celebrity or a field expert or something like that.
Oh, I do read a lot of nonfiction.
Okay.
I get dinged for that, but I do read a lot of it. And forwards depends on who writes it. I mean, sometimes a Will Wheaton forward can be fun. A Neil deGrasse Tyson forward can be fun if it is one of these science topics that I might be talking about. But if it's the guy's brother, it makes no sense. But then again, most forwards are not. Most forwards are from someone more famous than the author themselves.
Well, okay, and that's why I don't find forwards very interesting. They basically are extended testimonials.
Yes, they are.
Right. If I've already purchased the book, I will skim the forward and get right to the meat of it.
Yep.
I don't mind them. Usually short. They're kind of fun.
Yeah. Now, the fact that you got Neil deGrasse Tyson to write a forward for you, maybe you got something going on, but I don't necessarily need to read it to understand that you got an endorsement.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely think forwards are more like we're taking off our author hats and putting on our marketing hats when we talk about forwards.
Yes,
And I will
definitely.
I will
That's
say
exactly
this,
right.
that I read a
think
lot of
that-
nonfiction.
I think
I'm sorry,
that
Marty, go ahead,
forwards are less crippling to sales as well.
Mm.
Yeah,
So if he's got a nonfiction
And-
book and they're looking at preview pages, maybe
Right.
seeing an endorsement from
Yeah.
somebody in the field or a celebrity, or it depends on what the book is.
Right.
Yeah.
It could be very, very interesting.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I will say is that, again, I read a lot of nonfiction books. Very rarely do they have forwards.
I'm actually writing. I was hired to write a book about sled hockey, which is ice hockey played by disabled athletes. And my book will have a forward by a very respected Boston Bruin, former Boston Bruin, so a former NHL player, which I think that that's an appropriate forward. It meets the topic. It lends credibility to myself, to the book, and there's nothing wrong with having a little name power. I mean, we all would love a great blurb. Sure, why not have a testimonial? But if you're writing a book about science, and you can get Bill Nye to write a forward for you, like, go for it. I would say even if we all agree, yeah, we kind of skip them as readers. As writers, I think it's smart to accept a forward that makes sense. But like you said, Jeffrey, it does have to make sense.
Yeah,
the
my goal
question-
is to have a forward written by Marty for one of my non.
There you go.
There you
And
go.
my question would be, who does Bill Nye get to write his forward?
Neil deGrasse Tyson, of course. Right? Yes. All right. So, anything else about forwards before we move on to the other two? No, we're less aggressive towards forwards.
So we can move forward now.
Very good. But so prefaces. I think we're going to get aggressive again when we talk about prefaces, but we'll see. Prefaces are going to be written by the author as a reminder, explaining how and why the book came to be, usually before a nonfiction book, but sometimes before a fiction book, if the fiction book, has an interesting story of how the author was inspired or something like that. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Is this a yay or nay on prefaces?
I think this one. Oh, go ahead, Marty, and I'll say my piece.
My most recent book has a preface.
Okay, so we might have a yay.
Now, this is a collection of short stories.
That's different.
So it is appropriate in this context that
Right.
I, as the author, talk about the events surrounding the compilation of this set of short stories.
Okay.
And so I'm okay with prefaces in certain contexts.
Mhm.
I've never seen a preface like in a novel. I'm actually copying the front matter and everything from other collections that I have in my library that I enjoy. So
Yeah.
the prefaces are common in those kind of collections. So
Yeah.
in that context, it works for me perfectly well.
Right. And I think, Marty, you have a perfect counterexample to what I'm just saying, but because there is no main narrative to wend your way, you wouldn't inject. Because the thing that I would say for preface is the same thing I said about prologues in terms of if you're just giving an info dump, beats of how you got to do this story. And I will tell you right now that the best nonfictions are generally stories where the author injects themselves. So there's a narrative that weaves through the story that is the author or the character that the author is putting. Write nonfiction like fiction, but just make it factual. That is my best advice for a nonfiction writer. And in this case, if you can inject yourself into the novel, into the nonfiction, then why isn't your prologue in that nonfiction itself?
Preface, you mean?
The preface, excuse me. Yeah, thank you. I'm messing.
I
this
also
up.
like them short.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Yeah.
I think the preface has a place and a purpose in nonfiction. I think the author should keep it short so they don't lose the audience. In fiction, I typically see prefaces for anthologies or for collections like Marty did. You don't usually see it for.
So I said short, it's one page.
Yeah, yeah.
And look, hey, there's Shay right there.
Oh my gosh,
Right.
and
And
Pierre,
David.
my dog.
Yeah, and I think I'm in the back there.
That's lovely.
Although I will say, for some of the stuff I published, the information about the story that you said you put in the preface, I would introduce stories, but I would typically leave the how the story got written and stuff. I usually put that in an afterword. Your mileage may vary.
It has an afterword as well. So your mileage may vary.
No, okay, so here's the question then. Why do you have preface and an afterword? What was it? Why did you separate them and not just do one?
I
Good
copied
question.
other
Marty is stumped.
other collections
Oh,
that
yeah.
I had in my collection is all.
Okay.
And I followed the, I'm all about emulating success. So
Sure.
if somebody else has done it and has done a good job with it,
How
I'm
did the
just-
content
I'm
differ?
just straight up copying.
How did the content differ between your afterword and your preface? What did you talk about in either?
Let's have a look. Oh, and the afterword in here, I talk about the fact that I compiled this during 2020, the year of COVID.
Oh, right.
And it was just a little annotation about, how messed up that year was, really.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is a shout out to David, Shay, and myself, which we all appreciate.
Right. Now that's in the acknowledgments.
We're gonna have
That's
to,
not
true.
in the afterward.
so
Right,
since
that's
this,
true.
Since this episode is forwards, prefaces, introductions, and prologues, we'll have to do another episode that's epilogues, acknowledgments, and afterwards. So
Yeah, I
everything
guess
is
so.
back matter. So
I
we'll do
guess
that
so.
next time. So we'll stick on prefaces now. I
Right.
agree with what you guys have been saying. I can go either way with prefaces. I'm okay with them when they're short, like we mentioned, a page or two, page and a half. I'm okay with them when they have a purpose, when there actually is an interesting, interesting comments to make about how the book came to be, or explain the short stories, where they all came from, what they were featured in before, etc., whatever themes that connect them. And I'm definitely more okay with prefaces when they're not accompanied by a foreword and an introduction, end of this, end of that, just everything piled on. I think kind of like pick one at that point. But you do see books that have them all, so we won't harp on them too hard. The last one, before I move on, are we good to move on to the last? All right. The last one, I think, will get the least amount of grief from us, but I will be curious to see, which is an introduction, which, again, normally is nonfiction and addresses the main topics that the content of the book will address, and provides a roadmap for the reader to know where these chapters are going to take him or her, and what's going to be argued, how it's going to be argued, etc. I think that these are the most acceptable because they are pretty standard in nonfiction work, and really help. Number one, help because they provide that roadmap, and number two, really address the main meat of the story. So it's almost not front matter. It's almost just like a long thesis statement.
An abstract. An abstract and a thesis.
Right, exactly. So what do you guys think? Do you like them, or do you also against them?
No, I do like them.
Okay.
In fact, I'm slowly compiling a memoir, and it's already got reserved space for an introduction in there, which I am sure is going to end up being an apology to my parents about all the grief I put them through. So yeah, I'm cool with introductions.
Jeffrey?
Oh, okay. So I'm a little bit against.
You're a little against,
mainly
all right,
because again, I read a lot of nonfiction, and sometimes it's sort of like get to the story. I mean, oh, that's well and good. I know all about relativity, so just start talking about relativity. Don't tell me about what relativity is. I know what relativity is. I want to just hear the story about relativity.
Yeah, you don't want to hear about the patent clerk and stuff.
I'm somewhat between Marty and Jeffrey. I don't have a problem with an introduction for a nonfiction book, but really for most of the things I'm likely to read, give me a table of contents with like real names for real sections, so I can just go to the sections that matter to me. Now, again, it depends on whether that's a computer science topic. I might want the introduction a bit more if it's a historical piece of nonfiction or something like that. So it may vary a little bit based on topic, but introductions by me, they get skimmed at best.
As someone who's done them or has experience with introductions as both a reader and a writer in college, because at my university I had to write, an 80-page or whatever thesis in order to graduate cum laude. A little flex there, obviously, but I know from a writing point of view that it was very useful to write an introduction, and it was it was very important to the thesis. But I also do agree with Dave from a reading point of view. I don't pay as much attention, and I do, sort of get eager just to jump into chapter one. So maybe it's moving in a direction where introductions are also moving away from the academic standard, and we'll be arguing, hey, just start chapter one, like we were arguing with prologues, and maybe that's the direction that it's going.
All I gotta say is, if I had an 80-page thesis to write, I would have a preface, a foreword, an introduction, an afterword, and a postscript.
Yes.
Right.
I love it. I love it.
But I will just say that a lot of the times that the facts that come out in those the introductions, rather, the facts that come out in the introductions are fast and furious, and it's sort of like bewildering to get all those facts without the longer story that brings you to them. So sometimes I just think let's slow down a bit, get to chapter one, and let's just take the story one step at a time.
Yeah, I think that with all of these, especially we were talking earlier about how upcoming writers emulate writers before them, and I think that with all of these prefaces, prologues, etc., some upcoming writers sort of approach it like thinking, you know, gee, I have to get a white chef hat in order to be a good cook, you know, and they say, well, hey, you know, writers do prologues and writers do forwards, and you know, I'll look very sophisticated if I have a preface, if I have an introduction, if I have all of this stuff, because you know, I want to have all the trappings that writers have. But I think that if anything, our conversation has demonstrated that it's really, that's all it is sometimes, is trappings, and if that is all it is, then they should be cut. So, but you know, I understand, we get it. Other writers have done it, and we want to be like them, and so that's just a trap that you fall into. But all right, any last closing thoughts on forward, preface, introduction, and prologue?
Yeah, it's a really important topic for a beginning author. It is a potential landmine for a lot of people because they're easy to do wrong.
Okay, thank you. Jeffrey?
I will say this, just to rephrase what I've been saying. The first taste is free. The rest of it, you got to pay for.
Dave?
Well, I think we've neglected to mention one very important prologue. The Shadow War of the Night Dragons, Book 1, The Dead City, Prologue by John Scalzi. It was actually nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Short Story. So he wrote a fake prologue, made it as absolutely silly as possible, and it got nominated for a Hugo Award.
Well, what was it?
Wow.
So prologues can be fun.
Yeah, when they're
It
short
was
stories.
complete fun, but it's nominated for an award.
So the prologue was just preposterous?
It was totally preposterous, and there was no story to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
It was just called, you know.
Oh, so then it was chapter 1.
It was basically chapter 1 of the whole.
It was all the chapters, right? There was nothing else.
Yeah.
It was your free
I
for
have not
nothing.
read it. Is he actually mocking the use of prologues?
Oh, he's mocking everything. He's mocking epic fantasy and everything. Again,
Wow.
The Shadow War of the Night Dragons, Book 1, The Dead City, Prologue.
Mhm.
And that's all there is.
Well, okay. My final word, I guess, is that all 4 of them are at significant risk of being skipped. So understand that risk. For us nonfiction writers or nonfiction listeners, forwards, prefaces, and introductions need to have a purpose. And for our fiction listeners, prologues, we are against it and we discourage them. And that is our final. That's my final.
And I will say one last thing.
Dave is a so-so, but mostly 75% we discourage.
Shay,
Yeah, more like 95%.
I look forward to hearing what your friend thinks of this episode, if you can convince your friend.
Oh, you know, what the hell? His name is Udi. Hi, Udi.
Hey, Udi, thanks. Great question for
Hey,
us.
you're wrong.
You should invite him next time so we can beat him up a little
I
bit.
did. That was my idea last time, that we do that. Udi, you're welcome on the show anytime and debate us. We would
Yes,
love it.
please do. And we won't be hard on you. Trust me, man.
No, it'll be fun.
We
Mhm.
just won't care what he thinks.
Ow.
He's a great writer, though.
No. No,
All
we
right.
won't be like this cast. We'll be nice to you.
All right. That's it.
That's it. Another great episode.
Another finally
See you guys
structured
next
episode,
week.
y'all.
All right, Chowder.